Set.
Hello and welcome back to the 4-Minute Mull. I'm Ross Tucker, and I guess first order of business is to apologize to you for the very long delay between these videos. That's totally on me. It's work related. I've got this trip coming up to Europe next week, for which I've got a lot of stuff to prepare, plus a lot of stuff back here needs to be done by then. So I've just been absolutely bombed and snowed under with work, hence the delay. It's not been a completely idle 2 weeks. Those of you who follow on Twitter would have perhaps seen over the last couple of weeks, especially last week, there was a fairly lively and at times spicy, heated debate with Paula Radcliffe around transparency and anti-doping. Many of you weighed in on that, for which I'm very grateful. I think it was overall quite a thought-provoking and important conversation to have. It was quite frustrating to me at times as well, because I couldn't get the message on the transparency issue, which is what I think it needed to be, which I'll come back to, because this video today is all about anti-doping, which includes transparency, but also includes a few other things. I wanted to do it last week, but then as I said, I just got worked under. And in the end, that was probably a blessing, because just in the last couple of days, I've had the opportunity to think a little bit more, read one or two articles that have triggered some different thoughts, which I think is important, because I do hate the idea of just dumping these ill-formed, incomplete thoughts on these videos. And so I'm quite pleased now that at least I've refined and thought about things a little bit differently, and now I'm confident to do that. And so one of the articles that I read was this one, which talks about how the IOC are hopeful that they will soon have new tests that allow them to detect doping substances for longer. Now, the background to this is that at the moment, the tests for EPO can only really detect traces of those substances for several days, maybe 1 week at most. And what they're hoping is that they will soon have a new test that can detect it for 2, 3, possibly even 4 weeks. And that would be a big deal, because one of the big limitations in the current anti-doping framework is, first of all, that the anti-doping at the moment relies on what I call detect to catch. In other words, they're going to test your urine or your blood, they're going to find the substance, then you're going to face sanction. I think history has shown that to be a completely ineffective way to do it and needs to be changed. We'll get to that. But nevertheless, that's where we are. And one of the problems with that is that an athlete can dope on a Tuesday, and unless you test him on Tuesday, Wednesday, maybe Thursday, by Friday that drug is gone. And so he's getting the benefit without being ever possible to be caught. And so when the sensitivity of a test improves so that instead of detecting it here, you can detect it at a lower level, in theory, what that does is it narrows the window of opportunity for the athlete to dope. And so that's progress. It's the same progress, by the way, that saw at the time of the 2012 Olympic Games, only 0.18% of all samples tested positive, whereas when they were reanalyzed, targeted testing to reanalyze them a few years later, it's up to 9.4%. That happens in part because the tools are constantly improving. Here's the problem, though. When we talk about anti-doping, the tools are only one half of the equation. And so this is a saying I've used before, but I think it bears repeating. It's that old cliche of where there's a will, there's a way. The tools, the scientific tests, the EPO, the athlete biological passport as an example, those are tools that help us improve the way. From my perspective, the big issue remains the will. And if there's one take-home message or one key thing that I've observed in the build-up to these Winter Olympic Games and the whole dispute between the IOC and CAS, it's that there's such a tremendous tension that exists, so many conflicts of interest, because you never know whether those authorities genuinely have an appetite to actually do anti-doping. Do they actually want to catch cheats, and do they actually want to punish them? That's the problem, in my opinion, that has happened, is that there's been a real loss of confidence that those things are in fact true. And it's not just me saying that. This is a quote from one Richard Pound, who was the first head of the World Anti-Doping Agency, and he says himself, in general, there is no appetite to successfully undertake an anti-doping campaign. And so what we've got basically is a fundamental problem that relates to the will. And so when we say where there's a will, there's a way, well, what happens when there's no will? And the reality then is that you could come up with a test, let's call it a scientific assay for EPO or testosterone, that thing could be so good that you could find one molecule of testosterone in the Pacific Ocean, be completely and utterly useless, unless it's also backed by a real desire from high. Because again, yeah, I don't want to generalize and say that everyone in anti-doping is conflicted. There are people within WADA and within anti-doping agencies around the world who are genuine and sincere. But the problem to me seems to be, and I hate to use the word political, it's too broad and non-specific, but there seems to be a failure of the desire at a political, higher strategic level to actually make the thing work. And so until that gets fixed up, these relatively small advances are not going to be cause for massive excitement. It's like back in Sochi, you had the most sophisticated anti-doping program ever developed. That it was even praised as that by WADA. And meanwhile, the Russians had drilled a hole in the wall. They were handing the urine through it and then using coffee granules to darken the urine to match it to what they'd collected a few weeks before when the athlete wasn't going to fail the test. So it doesn't matter how sophisticated you are. In the presence of other factors, all those sophisticated tools are just fancier ways to fail. And so on that note, there are a couple of things need to change. Number one is those conflicts of interest, the tension between authorities and athletes and anti-doping and IOC and so forth. That needs to be resolved. And the key thing, in my opinion, is that you have to change the incentive to actually incentivize anti-doping to catch dopers. At the moment, I think the incentives are bigger to actually make doping disappear and to hide it away and to suppress what's actually happening. So that needs to change. Number two, the tools need to improve. So we've seen some evidence that that is happening. Number three, transparency. And that's why the Paula Radcliffe thing last week was so important. It was frustrating because it was impossible to stay on point because so many people just see Radcliffe and they lose focus on the issue. But if you followed that discussion for the last decade, and again, I can't speak for other people, only myself, I've been consistent over the last decade saying that there's insufficient transparency in doping. Not just doping. I mean, it came up with the Caster Semenya issue as well. But the power files in cycling, the TUEs, the medication used, the Radcliffe stuff. Henry Skuman 2 weeks ago was cleared after Fancy Bears had leaked information. There was no transparency there either, and I criticized that also, but he wasn't Paula Radcliffe, so not many people got involved in that discussion. The point is this: transparency is important because there can be no accountability without transparency. And at the moment, what is happening is that all the decisions, all the anti-doping stuff is being done in the shadows. And it's time for that stuff to be placed into the light. And that's why Paula Radcliffe's excuse that she's not going to make her data available because it will undermine the integrity of the process and affect how effective the biological passport is completely bogus. And that's what needed to be called out. It wasn't about Radcliffe and what her specific data was. It was about the concept of transparency and that without it, there cannot be progress and there will be no restoration of credibility on the anti-doping front. And then the fourth one, and I know I'm way over time, forget 4-minute mull, but then again, it's the first one in weeks, so bear with me. The fourth one is that anti-doping authorities have to have more investigative powers. They cannot continue to rely on this archaic and ineffective test the urine, find the drug, ban the athlete. It doesn't work. Absolutely ineffective because it's too easy to dodge that system. And it's only when investigations happen. And in the last decade, those investigations have been primarily the domain of the media. Guys like Seppelt and Nick Harris of the Daily Mail exposing the Russian scandal. Then you're relying on whistleblowers like the Stepanovas and Rodchenkov. Until that process of investigation is taken on by the anti-doping agencies, we will continue to make tiny, tiny gains. It's like we're on our hands and knees looking for pennies while there's a $100 note lying here on the table. That's where the difference will come. But again, what's going to make investigation the priority is the will. And so until there is a will, there will be no way. I'm sorry for going over time by a lot. I'll try and be more regular and therefore shorter in the future. So do join me next time.